first of all, so you're William, and so you're younger,
Yes.
military, right?
Yes.
And grew up. You said you grew up Presbyterian, and then were Baptist for a while. I think, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start there. How old were you when you started, deconverting or started having doubts or whatever?
I guess like earlier in my life, give or take around age 10 or so.
Sure.
The reason I stopped going to the Presbyterian church was my folks divorced when I was 7.
Yeah.
And then we just moved around a lot, and would go to whatever church.
And then were they both, after that, continued themselves going to churches? Or did one become more irreligious? Or you don't have to divulge all the details too much, but I'm just saying
No, for a while, my father was very just a-religious. I wouldn't say, atheist, just very solid, in between agnostic. And then my mom was definitely more religious. She was the one I lived with, and she would try to make a point to go to churches, but whether that happened every Sunday or not, it just depended on the week.
Yeah. Okay. So that maybe played a role too, you think, or?
Yeah, definitely. Just because, especially so young, and I mean honestly, even now, we went to a slew of different churches. We went to Presbyterian first. We went to Methodist, Lutheran, Nazarene, various non-denominational churches, a couple mega churches. And
you've gone to more churches than I have.
Yeah, most of them in Florida. Most of them in
Yes,
Florida.
They have a lot of churches in Florida. So what, like if you were picking one or two things, what was it then that got you to where you're like, okay, I don't think I really believe this anymore? Or maybe you didn't really feel like you ever believed that, I don't know.
I guess part of it was, one, because they all just blurred together. They all had, the story of God, but in their own flavor, I guess. But then the second part of it too was just my family and I grew up pretty poor. We moved around a lot for one reason or another, and the common questions that a lot of Christians ask popped in my head. If God is all loving and supposed to take care of you, then why is this happening? Why are these difficulties constantly happening in my family's lives? Whether it be something as simple as the divorce or having to move around, to things a lot more complicated, unemployment or whatever my family faced at that given time. So I just
so obviously a lot of people have those questions. Actually, by the way, that question is called the Epicurean riddle, and it was a classical Greek philosopher who first posed that question. It's kind of interesting. It's a very old question.
I know that quote. Oh crap! Now I'm drawing a blank.
It's fine.
Yeah.
So so that was one big thing. By the way, I didn't even ask you if you were sort of how you think of yourself now, if you're more sort of agnostic or where you sort of think you are.
I solidly say I'm an agnostic atheist because that's what I know the most accurate title is. Mm-hmm. If I'm being totally honest, sometimes I do, miss some sort of a belief in a supernatural thing.
Yeah.
Whether it be, magic or prayer or a god or multiple gods.
Yep.
Just because
something transcendent, I guess you mean.
Yeah, and if anything, at the very least, it added some more excitement to life rather than just knowing we're natural. What we live in is a natural life.
Would you say it added meaning or more excitement or both?
Both. Obviously depending on what religion I was studying at the time, because that was the path I went down first, was looking into various different religions, Norse paganism, Buddhism, theistic Satanism.
And did you do that through like YouTube, or what would you mean you went looking down, like
a little bit of...
What was the method?
Yeah, a little bit of YouTube, and then when I heard about it, I would look it up on my own. That's when I probably heard about Anton LaVey. and in the Church of Satan around 12 years old or so.
It's pretty early.
Yeah, I just enjoyed researching things, and I still haven't gained my degree in history for it. So, that was the route I went first. Is I guess I felt a hole that Christianity was not filling, and I tried to fill that with other things. Yeah. And naturally, that led to the recoil of falling back into Christianity. Saying no one can provide a love as great as God, fill you as great as God. Yeah.
The Augustinian, St. Augustine said that our soul is restless until we rest in Him. That kind of idea.
Yes. Yeah. So I went just back and forth with that for a while. And then later in my teen years, around 15 or so, my dad converted to Christianity. He became an ordained minister, actually
really?
based out of Austin, and the girl I was dating at the time, her mother was a pastor at just a non-denominational church, or if they had a denomination, I didn't know it, but so I definitely had a more solid community surrounding me.
Yeah.
That kept me engaged in Christianity, and I stayed like that. When I enlisted in the Army, I went through. I went to chapel every Sunday. They have this basic training Bible challenge. They hand you these little camo Bibles, and it has the calendar of how long your boot camp is, and so you can mark the days. Yeah. And then every day you read a separate passage about endurance or difficulty or whatever you might be facing or thinking at the time. Yeah. So I completed that. I felt very strongly and passionate about being a Christian at that point, around 18 years old.
Yeah.
Then I guess the total flip side opposite happened. I went through a pretty traumatic event at my first duty station. I was in the wrong part of town at the wrong time, and I was assaulted and mugged.
Wow.
Yes, I got the living crap beaten out of me. Oh. I was just trying to pick my life up together. At that point, the girl who I was dating, the one whose mom was a pastor, her and I broke up just from distance. Yeah. I had a death in the family, all within about a month of each other.
Oh dear.
It was a very traumatic time, and naturally, being a Christian, I wanted to lean on God. I wanted to pray for the strength to get through it, and the silence was deafening. So I went back to where I was originally in my early teen years, just looking at other religions. Yeah. The one I fell on for a while was Norse paganism. I had a couple friends who followed Norse paganism, Odinism, and stuck with that for a little bit. It carried on until about 2020, 2021, and around that time, that's when I started listening to a lot of podcasters about atheism, because growing up, I never really, got to ask questions about atheism. I just knew it wasn't the belief in God. Right. And a couple churches I went to talked very, very strongly against atheism, saying that it was a totally ridiculous notion. And I didn't realize at the time how well talked about it, or how thoroughly talked about it is in books, in podcasts, in various forms of media.
It's dramatically changed, really, in about the last 15 years.
Yeah,
since what's called the new atheism hit the market.
Yeah, I've heard of new atheism and how that's definitely affected the whole change. I think one of the other big changes, or one of the other points I've heard definitely brought this around. It was just the internet. We no longer live in an age where 2,000 years ago, you had to have someone read the Bible to you, or read any religious text to you. We no longer live in an age 200 years ago where you had to travel by horseback to go to church, or carriage to go to church, and read more of the Bible, where the literacy rate was still pretty low. We live in an age where I can look up on my phone or laptop right now and find various opinions or studies about essentially whatever I want to research.
And yet, in some ways, there seems like there's more misinformation, I suppose, because the internet's very democratic, or traditionally it has been. So it still is. People can find you can pretty much find whatever affirmation you want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You always hear the argument, oh, you're just looking up what you want to look up to prove your point. Some of them could be just that, where someone just says something without fact checking it. But other things, not so much.
I still think I think you can do real searching for sure, and just authentically trying to get at the truth of things, and for sure.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree. If anything, I feel like that exact statement can apply both to theology and atheism.
It's one thing I've learned being in interviewing atheists over the last number of years, is because I wasn't in an atheist community when I was in high school, in the late 80s or something, but is how even within sort of atheism, it's there's lots of disagreement and lots of people, some of the new atheists from the 2000s that made atheism more popular internationally in the West, Richard Dawkins and stuff, wouldn't be allowed to speak in certain atheist conventions, So it's very it's almost got its own denominations now. We interview people from different wings of the atheist movement. James Lindsay or someone is very different from whatever. So it's whatever. And there's a guy that I've talked to before, Evan from Los Angeles, who's from the Atheists United, I think, and he says he doesn't even think atheism really is very unifying. It doesn't meaning it's really values that unite people. So he thinks we shouldn't even really be talking much about atheism, but more talking about values. It's kind of an interesting take. And he says some of his closest friends are religious, but they share his values, and he knows atheists that he doesn't associate at all with, even though because they don't have different values. How do you think? Because you obviously got Christians around you when you were growing up, and your dad, I guess, is still a pastor. How do you see Christians as dealing with if they went through the month of hell, you had? How do they? You must know how Christians normally think about that and why they don't just abandon their faith,
Yeah.
What do you think ultimately stops them from, or why do they keep believing that,
The I guess more politically correct answer would be that they just believe that much. They have perhaps more faith than I did,
There's got to be some sort of, everybody, even if someone's internal logic is false or wrong, there's still some internal logic. Because if I said to somebody, hey, I'll give you $500 million if you believe I'm a cat, you couldn't pretend you think I'm a cat even for $500 million. There's something in you really believe. In other words, belief is judging something to be true. So they have to judge it to be true at some level, even if all that bad stuff's happening. So there's got to be some kind of internal logic. So what do you think that would be that overcomes the feeling of, God doesn't care, or if he's there, he doesn't care, or something?
I think it's whatever kind of reinforcement they get around them. In psychology, you'll hear a lot of therapists, a lot of various psychologists say, if you start the morning, you look in the mirror and you say, I am worthy, I am loved, I'm strong, you give yourself positive affirmations, sooner or later your mind will start believing it.
Okay.
And then on the flip side, if you want to go to the downward spiral, if you say I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I'm terrible, I'm XYZ, then you will continue down that.
Yeah,
and
so it's like an ecosystem of reinforced beliefs that just doesn't get cracked.
Absolutely. So the church, of course, being one of those, your pastors, your deacons, your priests, whichever sect of, or whichever religion in general you believe.
Yep.
And then your family, if your family is religious, any friends you have, and then of course whatever your religious text is. I think it's John 8:12 says something along the lines of us walking through darkness and Jesus being the light that will get us through.
Yeah. I'm the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. I just happen to know that one.
And then, the probably the most famous psalm in the world, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil.
Yeah.
That's those kind of verses in the religious text.
Yeah.
I 100% agree are positive. They're inspiring, and who wouldn't want to have a loving, caring God alongside them to say, hey, things are tough right now, but you'll get through it one way or another, and it says so in the book. When I started researching atheism a lot more, and just various belief systems as well, that's when I really started diving more into just various other Bible stories and verses, less of the John 3:16 and Jeremiah 29:11s.
Yeah,
and
right.
Seeing what else the Bible says about God, and what was the history behind it. Because growing up, I never totally questioned who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were. Very modern names from 2,000 years ago. Yeah. I just accepted it. So I and a lot of other atheists say that they've probably read the Bible or whatever religion they deconstructed from, that religious text, about as much, if not more, than a lot of religious folk.
I think that's true. In my experience, there's a lot of people who, in their deconversion, I think, end up looking more closely at the Bible than they did when they were Christians, and then often a lot of Christians do. I'm a little bit of a reverse of that because I came from outside. So when I came in, I was reading the Bible, and because I can read the languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, but I learned it in a secular university, not from all my professors were irreligious, and so when I came to these texts, I was reading them very, very closely, and I feel like I still do. So it's weird because I'll sometimes do a video where I'm just responding to an atheist scholar or a non-sectarian biblical scholar or something, and they're reading something from the Bible, and I think, they just have gotten this wrong. This is my impression. They just didn't get this part right. It doesn't solve sort of like all the problems. So I've started now doing some things of just trying to say, I don't think this is quite right, but like you, I'm really just trying to get at the truth of it. So I don't feel like any need to try and trick myself. I don't think people want to trick themselves into believing something. But it's harder than people think to do that. I'm not claiming I do it all the time. I'm just saying it's really hard to do it. I was going to say, I think for me, and I think this would be true of a lot of Christians. I'm curious if you would either agree with this or if you disagree with this. Because I don't really disagree with everything you've said, by the way. Like, I think you had a really good insight into like why people continue to believe and stuff. But I would say that for most Christians, the cross of Jesus, the fact that he died, and I don't mean this in like a gospel way. I mean just as like the way Christians view that, as you know, is that this is how you know God loves the world, So when they have difficulties, they tend to think, well, I at least know this one thing. There's no way God would come into the world and die for me if he wasn't trying to do something good, So if they see like Jeremiah, even if they are like, there's this disconnect between Jeremiah and how they see the end of Matthew or the end of John, they'll let the end of the Gospel of John or Matthew where Jesus dies as like trump whatever seems dissonant with it, seems discordant. Because obviously anybody who's reading the whole Bible hits verses where they're like scratching their heads like, wow, Yahweh that's not what I thought Yahweh was like, So do you agree with me that in some ways they're letting, like, the belief that Yahweh actually came into the world and died sort of trumps a verse, even if it to their mind looks bad,
Yes, and I feel like they'll even try to then excuse a lot of the things that happen in the Bible.
Do you think it's like, in some ways I think people excuse it. Other times they'll just say, I don't understand that part. I can't say I really have an answer for that. But they believe this one big fact, that Yahweh came into the world and died for everybody, and therefore everything's viewed through that lens, like whatever I don't understand, I at least understand that.
That's definitely something that I can see. The thing that I tell myself as well, like whenever a topic like that comes up, is because everyone wants to focus on the good Bible verses, whether it's them again, like you said, saying they don't know the answer to why certain verses are the way they are, or trying to excuse them. The thing that I like saying is, especially studying history, everyone in history was a jerk. Just about everyone.
Was a jerk, you said?
Yeah. Just about everyone.
So everybody in history is like everybody today.
Yeah, fair enough. Everyone in history, just about that is generalizing, but majority of civilizations, of military leaders, of emperors, kings, they were awful. They, by our standards of societal politeness, of courtesy, they just didn't believe that. They would totally abuse women and children. They would keep slaves. They would do all these awful things, and so in the Bible that makes sense why that was a big theme in some of the stories. But then they try to throw that history in there, saying, oh well, everyone did this back then, so a bunch of children and millions of others killed, say during a flood, would by antiquity standards be about accurate. There's almost every other religion has a great flood story, which to that particular religion, I would say whatever deity caused it. And in Greek mythology, it was Zeus. In Norse mythology, it was Odin killing the giant Ymir. There's I think it's the Hindu mythology. There was a fish that warned a king about a flood coming, rather than the word of God.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so
a fish would sense.
fair enough. So just
what do you think
every other
do you know what
religion
C.S.
would have
Lewis's idea is of true myth? Have you ever heard that expression, true myth?
I'm sorry, say again?
Have you ever heard, C.S. Lewis, the
Yes.
thinker C.S. Lewis?
Yes.
He talked about true myth. Have you ever heard that?
I have not heard of that.
Well, so J.R.R. Tolkien, right, was a friend of Lewis, and Lewis was an atheist. And Lewis converted to theism, but not Christianity, right? So he wasn't a Christian, but he went from atheism to believing in God. And then he was having a conversation with Tolkien, who was a friend of his at, was it Cambridge? And he told Tolkien that one of the reasons he doesn't believe in Christianity is because the myths, it sounds too mythological. It's too similar to the myths of the, that he knew from the classical literature. And Tolkien said, have you ever considered whether it's true myth? And that was, C.S. Lewis for the rest of his life referred to that as the pivotal moment for him, was seeing Christianity as myth, but true myth, and seeing that the other myths weren't completely void of truth either. It was just an interesting idea. I was just curious if you had heard of it. That's all.
That's so I've never heard of it, but that's more or less a viewpoint that I try to have on, at the very least, the New Testament. To put it in a very Barney term, it's like a historical fiction.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know Jerusalem exists. We can cite historical events that have happened, the temples falling to various conquerors, and then them rebuilding. We can track a lot of these.
Like
things
we're almost like where an Aesop fable can have truth in it. You mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, true value.
Like if I wrote a story, say about Vietnam, but say the aliens were included in it.
Right.
Obviously, I'm including true facets of real war, a real place, perhaps the real armies and weaponry that were fighting during that time. But there's no documented aliens from Vietnam. I'm sure. Sure someone will
I see better
disagree.
now. I think I see better what you mean. So let me. So one thing that just strikes me as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about literature is, like, I'll ask people about Joshua, the book of Joshua, and I'll say, what's the book of Joshua about? We're almost done, and they'll say, particularly people who don't know, they'll say, well, it's the conquest of the land of Canaan. I'm like, yeah, and what happens in the book? Well, the Israelites go in and just slaughter a bunch of people, and then God, and then they get the land. It's like America. Whatever.
Sounds about right.
This is what I'm just saying. This is what people often tell me who I'm talking to are just in general. Okay, not necessarily the best Bible students. And so I will say, have you ever read Joshua and looked at the proportions of the actual story? What is it really about? Okay. So, for example, the opening story is this sack of Jericho, right? And I'll say, okay, what's the story? Like, if you took the chapters and laid them out, which chapters are about the sack of Jericho? What are the other chapters about? Because if I were looking at it that way, I would say the majority of the story about the sack of Jericho is about the deliverance of Rahab's family, who were Canaanites, and then the judgment that fell on Achan, who was an Israelite family. Okay? Now, that's an interesting set of proportions, that you have a Canaanite family and all the focus on how the prostitute asked for mercy and God granted them mercy and did not judge them, and then how an Israelite family were all judged and killed. And I think that's kind of surprising for a book that's supposed to be about the destruction of all the Canaanites. So I sometimes will try to sort of like ask people, have you really read it? Like, because it's got some surprising things that are proportionally, right? You wouldn't maybe expect that. Then you go to the next story. What's the next story? And I'll say, what's that about? Like, literally, what is it mainly about? And, oh, well, the next story is about the deliverance of the Gibeonites, who are a group of Canaanite tribes who were attacked by other Canaanite tribes, and how God delivered them. Well, that's not what you would expect the author. He's a Jewish author. People think of that as it's just all about the slaughter of the Canaanites. And I'm like, actually, this whole set of chapters is about yet another story where Yahweh, the God in the story, showed mercy to this whole group of tribes who were attacked by these other Canaanite tribes. And why did he deliver them? Because they came to the Israelites and looked for deliverance, for mercy. And I'm like, at some point, you have to be true to what the book is actually saying it's about. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
I'm not denying, of course, that the book also records the taking over of the land of the Canaan, But if you asked, what is it proportionally about? You would if someone asked me about what's the third Star Wars episode? Well, really, episodes 1 to 3. Right? If you said, what's it about? Have you watched Star Wars?
Yes.
Yeah, episodes.
Are you talking about an order of release or the
The original,
timeline?
the episodes 1, 2, 3, not the original 4, 5, 6.
Okay,
You know, so 1, 2, 3, right? Mm-hmm. I would say it's like almost operatic. It's about the tragic fall of Anakin into evil.
Vader.
Yeah, to become Vader. But as evil as Vader is in those like original, let's say the first 2.5 or whatever, you know what I mean? You have the first 3 sort of like try to get you to see the other side of him. You know what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. So you couldn't just say that Star Wars is all about how Vader is just evil. You would say, well, that's not actually true to what the story actually is. You have to at least let it be what it is, you know? So I feel like sometimes people will characterize some big parts of the Bible, like a book like Joshua, and I'll think they're not really reading it for what it actually says. It's a kind of caricature of what it is. So, but that's hard. It's hard to go read something for what it is, you know, partly because we get locked in on small parts and we miss, you know, big parts. And then that's not to take away from small parts, you know.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
Yeah, but do you feel like that sometimes too? That? Or...
I feel like that can go one direction or another. Kind of like what we were talking about earlier, how obviously there's the very loving and encouraging verses throughout the Bible, but then there's also ones that are pretty terrifying.
Yeah. By the way, I did mean to include a Christian can be just as guilty of that by looking at a book and sort of, as you say, noticing these really nice, sweet verses in the middle of a minor prophet. Where most of the book is about judgment, right?
Yeah.
And then they pick one verse and they memorize it, and that's all. Rather than taking the whole book, and I would say, well, that's making the same mistake. You're
Absolutely.
not taking the book for what its whole message is, you know. So I feel like that's something I'm always trying to talk to people about, you know. But of course, that assumes like if people are talking about Habakkuk or whatever, Micah, how many people are really reading it that closely, you know, and able to talk about it like in a big way. So anyway, that's one thing that comes to my mind. Man, I could talk to you for a long time.
I enjoy talking about it because, like I said before I threw on the microphone, I really enjoy trying to find that happy medium.
Yep.
I personally think there are more cons than pros to just about any organized religion.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it can be very damaging to any number of people.
So
any
people
number
who are
of ways.
completely outside of organized religion, my inclination is that there's also a lot of bad things in those communities too.
100%. No, there's no community that is without its bad apples.
But it does seem like I would say, if Christianity is real, it should be then that Christians should in some way stand apart. They shouldn't just be like everybody else, right? If it's real.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help if people are just self-absorbed and self-centered and don't do the things the religion itself actually says we should be focused on.
And that's exactly where the problem lies. And again, it applies to both sides because I enjoy identifying and recognizing the positive effects that both religion and the lack thereof can have, but it's the ones in the comments on videos or in podcasts or on TikTok who say hard no, your religion is terrible, you're an awful person because you believe this, and I have seen those a little too often.
Yeah,
and
I
it does upset me.
I read them a lot because I get them on my videos.
It upsets me when people are that strongly set in their opinions that they won't even let you speak, honestly.
Yeah.
But then the same applies to Christianity, saying no, you're.
Cuts both ways for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I think those are signs of weakness, actually. I think people that are doing that, I think it's more, I personally think it's a little more born out of some sort of weakness, the need to kind of stomp on someone else or whatever. It doesn't matter to me whether you're religious or not. I think those instincts are more of like a self-protection or something, I don't know.
Yeah, I could definitely see it as an insecurity, and going back to what we talked about earlier as well, that could be their own way of reinforcing their beliefs, saying, oh no, I know God is real. I know this is your destination if you don't believe in him.
Yeah, so it makes me feel better and more secure to stomp on someone who's an atheist who I don't believe. Have you ever read Tom Holland? Do you know that name, Tom Holland? He's a historian, British historian.
I know Tom Holland, the Spider-Man actor.
Oh, right, I forget about that. Sorry, I forget about that. He's obviously way more important, the actor. But the historian, Tom Holland, British historian, very famous historian, wrote a book called Dominion. He's agnostic. I don't know if he says he's agnostic atheist, if that's his terminology, but he definitely says he's agnostic. But he wrote a book called Dominion, and it really got a lot of attention because he says basically, he's an ancient historian, mind you. He says basically he came to the realization at some point, like in his 30s, I think, that basically that Christianity essentially fundamentally altered the moral landscape of the world, and that he, as an agnostic historian looking at the world, thinks that his entire sort of fabric of moral conscience is quintessentially Christian, and that we modern people have no idea, for the most part, how bad the world was before Christianity. And I think it'd be interesting for you, who are both have a history degree, have your background religiously. I'd be interested to hear what you sort of thought of his argument. You know, it took a lot of people who are more on the agnostic atheist side, objected to his argument, and he's pretty smart dude. So it's interesting to hear his sort of defense of it. You know, he's done like 1 billion podcasts, so the easiest thing is go listen to him on an interview. And if you think he's worth it, then maybe go read the book. But anyway, great to talk to you.
It was great to talk to you, William.
Really.